We're up to the topic of fraction decimal percent conversions, FDP conversions. We have touched upon this before. Actually, this is a continuation. Because fraction decimal and percents are a huge part of the exam, the better we know them, the better off we are. And a big part of that is being able to convert from one form to the other. So we did address decimal percent conversions in the proportions and percents till you puke lecture. I wanted to address a couple more issues related to that topic today. So let's blow up the board here. And first, I'll come back to that later. So I've written some decimal numbers over here and some percent numbers over here. Remember that to convert between decimals and percents, it always involves shifting the decimal point 2 places. Then, of course, the question becomes, which way do we shift it? Do we shift to the left or the right? Now, for medium-sized numbers, let's say between 1% and 100%, this tends to be a little bit easier and more intuitive for most students. So I'll bet that you won't have very much trouble with these first two questions. Convert 0.361 into a percent. I think for most of us that's very easy, 36.1%. Convert 5.9% into a decimal. That one's a little trickier. Many students would write 0.59, but we can't forget that we're shifting 2 places, so there's a filler 0 here. But at least the instinct for shifting left or right is easier when the numbers are between 1% and 100%, like these are. Now, when we start getting into numbers that are very small or very large, that instinct starts to break down. Convert 0.00007 into a percent. Is it 0.007? Or is it 0.0000007? Which one do you like? And are you sure? Convert 0.004% into a decimal. Would it be 0.4 or 0.00004? Are you sure? Convert 165.8 into a percent. Is it 1.658%? Are you sure? Maybe you're starting to feel a little bit panicky. Left, right, I can't remember. I can't figure it out. I'm panicking. Okay, so the memory device for this is don't panic. And as you can see, the D stands for decimal and the P stands for percent. So if we just remember these two words, the DP, and when we're converting from one to the other, this will kind of remind us which direction to shift. So let's try that example out. Let's try this trick out with this example. Here I give you a decimal, 0.00007. We're converting it to a percent. So according to the don't panic mnemonic, when you're converting from a decimal to a percent, you're shifting to the right. You think about moving from the D to the P. So that reminds us that we're going to shift this decimal point 2 places to the right, and the correct answer is 007. In this problem, we are converting from a percent to a decimal. From a percent to a decimal is a leftward shift. So this decimal point comes 2 places over here. We're adding 2 more zeros. And so the correct answer was the one that's totally full of zeros. And here is a large decimal number, larger than 1, 165.8. So since we're converting from a decimal to a percent, we would shift this decimal point 2 places to the right. So this was wrong. And the correct answer will be a very large number, 16,580%. So we must remember that percents can be larger than 100, and they can be smaller than 1. And we shouldn't let numbers of those size freak us out. I think that the reason people make this mistake is because they don't like thinking about percents being that big. Okay, so that's it for decimal percent conversions today. Let's also talk about fraction decimal conversions. And let's blow up the board again here. So we're going to be converting back and forth between fractions and decimals. The first example will be the fraction 5/6. How do we convert that into a decimal? Well, there is a method to do this on paper, but remember that on the GRE you'll always have a calculator handy. Calculators work in decimals. So this is a really good task for a calculator to do. I would recommend that you just execute this on your calculator. You just type 5 divided by 6, and your calculator will tell you that the answer is 0.8 repeating 3. Now, I'm going to give you another recommendation. I know this one is much more challenging, but another recommendation to you is to do some memorizing. I recommend that if you're up to the task, you work on memorizing the conversions for the basic fractions, meaning those with a denominator up to 12. Since this denominator is less than 12, I would consider that a basic fraction. So in other words, it would be really great if you could just memorize that 5/6 converts to 0.8 repeating 3, and vice versa. Those memorized numbers help not only with speed, but also with being able to recognize things that other students won't pick up on. In other words, for example, you might see this decimal, and to other students that'll just be some random decimal that doesn't mean anything, but to you, you know that that means 5/6, and that might make the problem easier to solve. Okay, how do we convert a decimal into a fraction? Unfortunately, the calculator does not do this, so we do have to know how to make this conversion without a calculator. It's very easy if you remember how, and the secret is the place value system. So when we go back to decimals, we have to remember that there is no such thing as a ones place. This is tenths. Therefore, this is hundreds and thousands. So this decimal, by definition, means 125 thousandths. And then we should be able to reduce that. Since in a decimal, the denominator is always a power of 10, which only has 2's and 5's in it. If you're going to reduce this, you'll have to do it with dividing 2's and or 5's. In this case, it turns out that you can divide each number by 125, which is just a bunch of 5's, and it reduces all the way down to 1/8. Since this denominator is less than 12, it's also a basic fraction. So again, this would be in your recommended memorization list. You should know at the snap of a finger that 1/8 is 0.125, and that 0.125 is 1/8. I have a set of flashcards with the basic fractions on it. If you're interested, talk to me about getting that set of flashcards. But if you don't have the time to work on that memorization, then at least you need to be able to execute these conversions with the calculator or with the place value system.